chapter 4 is where we're going to find our text, and I'm going to be 1,000% honest while you're turning there. I had in my mind and I had in my notes all day today that I was going to preach on John the Beloved, and that was going to be a introduction to the man that we will be looking at, the letter he wrote, the epistles he wrote, the book of Revelation, next week. And then I realized that next week is not when we are starting the book of Revelation. I was a week ahead in my mind. And I thought, well, we'll still preach on John the Beloved. And then next week, we'll get a little more in depth with him. But then today happened. And today happened with a fury. And I got up this morning and I got to sleep in till about 7:30. Man, I felt like I'd slept for days, and got up and was refreshed, and shaved the old head, and set out for the day. Stopped by the hospital to make a visit, and of course, who I stopped to visit wasn't in his room. I don't know where he was, so I'm going to go try and find him tomorrow because he wasn't there when I was there. And I even walked out in the hallway, and no one was there to ask. And I said, okay, Lord, did the rapture happen? Like, am I that preacher that I said, well, Lord, it's just not your will for me to make this visit now. So I went on about my business, did some things, met with some people, and just kind of, as I went through the day, it kind of began to build to a crescendo of folks that are just still going through storms in their life. And God reminded me of a sermon, and he reminded me of this sermon. And I preached this sermon in the way back in 2020. And first time I preached this sermon was at Grace Baptist Church, May of 2020. And I keep that. It's a little secret. That way I don't preach the same sermon twice when I go to preach out. So I gotta know. But I was thinking about Miss Gloria Curry, who's gone home to be with the Lord, and she was one of the most encouraging women I ever knew in my life, especially when I first started preaching. I could have got up and preached and laid a complete goose egg, and been terrible, and she would have still given me a hug and said, that was great, with her little weak voice. I remember preaching this sermon, and I remember so clearly talking to her about it afterwards. And I don't know if you'll remember or not, but probably about a year or so ago, I preached out of this same text, and I preached a sermon entitled During the Storm. Well, the secret is this is actually a two-part sermon. That was the first part. You got it a year ago. So now finally God has laid it on my heart to give you the second part of that sermon. But if you look with me in Mark chapter 4, verse 36 through 41, Mark 4, verse 36, Mark chapter 4 and verse 36 says this. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship, and there were also with him other little ships. And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow, and they awake him, and said unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind. He said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, I'm sure you cannot remember when I preached on this text before a year ago, unless you took really good notes. And if you did, good for you. But before we get into the storm here and what happens after the storm, and this familiar account of the storm here that the apostles see with Jesus and sleep in the hinder part of the ship, and we all have heard the story before, but about a year ago I preached on During the Storm, and I had full intentions of preaching the second sermon that night, and God didn't let me do it. But just to remind you of what happens during the storm, Jesus led them into the storm. In verse 35. In verse 35 it says, In that same day, when even was come, he saith unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side of the sea. Jesus Christ led them directly into the storm. He did not say, you might not want to go there. He said, let us go. Let us go to the other side. And he knew, being God, that he was going to take them directly through a storm that would scare them to death. And let me just remind you, for those that I spoke to today, some may be watching this evening, those people I encountered at Siders Jewelers of all places that told me about storms, can I just tell you something? God knows where you're at. He lets you be there for a reason. He led them into the storm. Jesus Christ was not surprised that the storm came, and God's not surprised by the storm you're in either. So then, during the storm as well, this was the second part of that sermon, Jesus was with them during the storm. In verse 38, and he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on the pillow. He was there with them the entire time, in the ship, with them during the storm. So that leads to the second point of that sermon. That was, no matter where you're at in your life, Jesus Christ is with you, Christian. Even when you feel like he is absent. Because he was asleep on a pillow, and they go and they wake him up and they say, carest not that we perish. He's asleep. He doesn't care. You know, Jesus can multitask. And you may think that God's asleep at the wheel, but he is never asleep. He always knows what's happening. And then the third part of that sermon was this. Jesus controlled the storm the entire time. In verse 39, we see this. And he arose and he rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. You see, Jesus Christ is in charge. It is not the devil. Stop giving the devil credit for what God allows in your life. Stop it, Christian. Stop giving the devil credit for certain things in your life. Because yes, the devil does attack us, and yes, the devil does discourage us, and yes, the devil does want to see us fail, but sometimes we must accept the fact that God has led us there and is in control of the storm, and he has us there for a reason. And remember that it's only in fire that gold is purified. It is only in fire that a chunk of iron becomes a sharp, two-edged sword. It is only with the beating and the pounding of the hammer and the heat that you get anything worth having. And maybe that's what God has done to us. Maybe that's why we are there in the storm. And just remember that he is in control of the storm. And when he wants it to stop, it will. Peace be still, and there was a great calm. An eerie calm on the sea. There was a great calm. When it says that word that is translated great calm means almost a calm as in a tomb. That's still. And God can stop it whenever he wants. And in fact, he will stop it when he wants. But today, we're not going to focus on any of that. That was just the sermon. That was the first part of this sermon that you heard a year ago, and I'm sure you've already forgotten it by now. Today, we want to talk about what happens after the storm. You see, we always focus on the storm. We always focus on during the storm and what's going on during the storm. But what happens after the storm? We see some things happen after the storm, Christian, that tells us what we are to expect in our lives after storms and trials and tribulations we go through. The first thing I want to see, what happened after the storm? What did Jesus do after the storm? First, he conveyed his disappointment in them. Look with me in verse 40. It says this. And he said unto them, why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And just a few days before this storm happened, they were with Jesus at what became known as the Sermon on the Mount. And remember that? This great Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said things like, let not thy heart be troubled. Jesus said things like, fear not. Jesus told them over and over and over and over again. Many of his points in the Sermon on the Mount revolved around not fearing anything because I'm with you. That was just a few days before this storm happened. That was just a few short days before they found themselves on the boat. They had an overabundance of fear in spite of the fact that God had told them not to fear. In Luke 5:10, fear not was the first thing, one of the very first things Jesus told his apostles when he called them. Fear not. That was one of the very first words, the first two words that Jesus said to the apostles. But they had overabundance of fear. And Jesus relayed his disappointment in them. He conveyed his disappointment in them because he said, "Why are ye so fearful?" In evaluating us after the storm, could it be said of us that we have an overabundance of fear during it? I know it can be said of me that I do. You see, we come through the storms in our life, and then sometimes once we get through the storm, we feel a little conviction in our hearts, don't we, about how we handled it. That's God saying, "Why are ye so fearful?" I was there. That's the Holy Spirit nudging you and just conveying a little bit of disappointment in us. You think, boy, we just got through a storm, and Jesus, the first thing he does is convey his disappointment in us. Why do we have so much fear? Yes, in fact, he does, because he tells us over and over and over again in the Bible to not fear, to have no fear. What does it say in 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7? 2 Timothy, I think I can turn there. I used to be a sword drill champion. 2 Timothy 1:7 says this, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be thou not ashamed of the testimony of the Lord, nor of me, his prisoner, but be thou a partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God." God has not given us a spirit of fear. There was a wild-eyed young man with beautiful hair on Sunday morning that talked about fearful Christians. And sometimes when we come through a storm, we realize that we had an overabundance of fear and an underabundance of faith. Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? Let me just review what the apostles had just seen right before this storm. This is what they had seen. In Luke 5, they saw that Jesus controlled the fish in the sea because he gave them a great dearth of fish. And then, if you look also in the Gospels, you see that he had healed Simon's mother-in-law. Now, whether or not Simon thought that was a good thing or not, I don't know. But he healed Simon's mother-in-law. He healed her from her deathbed. We see that he had just cast out demons. He had opened up the eyes of the blind. They have been with Jesus but a short time, and he had shown them that they should not have fear and that they should have faith in him. But he said, "Why do you have an overabundance of fear and an underabundance of faith?" After the storm, that's what happens. Jesus conveys his disappointment in them. Now, you may not remember the sermon from before, but you may remember that when I talk about this is one of Olivia's favorite things because she has a scientific mind. But I said fear and faith have an inverse relationship. Potassium and sodium have an inverse relationship. So this is the way it works. When the sodium level is up in your body, the potassium level goes down. And then we give you a bunch of potassium and it goes up and the sodium level goes down. It's an inverse relationship. Now you know you can be a nurse. Faith and fear have the same relationship. The more fear you have in your life, your faith is down here. But when you raise your faith level, your fear falls away. You see, Jesus had told them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" He didn't say little faith. He didn't say a smidgen of faith. He said no faith. He said you had no faith during that storm. After the storms in our life, it can be said of us many times. It can be said of me. I was talking to someone today and I was explaining to them that as a pastor of a church, there are times when you have an overabundance of fear and very little faith. And you try not to give people canned answers as a pastor. You just need to pray. Pray, buddy. That's true, you do. But when you're in the middle of a storm and you're getting the tire kicked out of you, it is easy to have an overabundance of fear. And any pastor, any preacher, or any man or woman of God that tells you that they've never been in a storm and had way more fear than faith, they're lying to you because that's human nature. Now, God conveys his disappointment in them after the storm that they did have an overabundance of fear and they had an underabundance of faith. But I want you to notice that he does not leave them in the middle of the ocean. He just conveyed his disappointment in them. After a storm in your life, you have to evaluate and look at these things, or you will have learned nothing from the storm, and that would be a tragedy. That God has given you the opportunity to grow your faith and to diminish your fear, and you did not do it. Why do you think Jesus conveyed these things to them? It was not to be mean. It was to be a parent to them and a mentor and a father figure to them, to say, next time this happens, have more faith, because you saw me stop it, the storm. So after the storm, we see that. We see the conveying of disappointment. But then in Mark chapter 5 and on down through, we see that he confirmed their faith in him. So not only did he convey disappointment, but then immediately following, he confirmed their faith that they did have in him. So after coaching comes confirmation. If your child has ever been on a sports team and their coach never conveyed disappointment in them, your child learned nothing on that team. Can I just tell you that? I used to love when Ian played football and I would see Darst or one of those guys just eating his lunch on the sideline. I loved it. Because you know what? He didn't miss the next tackle. And yes, there was disappointment. There was coaching, but then after coaching was confirmation. Now, you know that old spot on the butt? You know, I don't know if they do that anymore. Our coach always just, why do they do that? Whack you on the bottom. Like, it's crazy. But our coach would get in our face and then smack you on the bottom, send you back there and confirm, go out there and do what I just showed you. So after the coaching that Jesus gives them comes confirmation. He confirms their faith in him. He says, this is why you have faith in me. Yes, you were afraid. Yes, your faith was lacking. But let me remind you of a few things. If you look in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, you see something where God is confirming their faith in him. In Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, and they came over into the other side of the sea to the country of the Gadarenes. Now, if you've probably guessed by now, the demonic of Gadara is here. And they find him, and he's in the tombs, and he's possessed by a legion of devils, and he's slicing himself with rocks, and he's cutting himself. He's running around naked. No man can bind him. That's what we see immediately following this storm. Not only do they see Jesus stop the storm, he says, let me remind you of who I am now, that you're out of this storm. So in Mark 5, 1 through 9, we see this man, and he has been bound. In verse 3, it says, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because he had often been bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken to pieces, neither could any man tame him. This was an insurmountable thing for this man. But Jesus being Jesus, and it's no accident that that's who they found on the other side after the storm. He says this is an insurmountable thing for man, but it is insignificant to God, because in Mark 5:13 we see this. And forthwith Jesus gave them leave, and the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down to the steep place into the sea, and they were about 2,000, and they were choked in the sea. I want you to notice how it says that, and forthwith Jesus gave them leave. He spoke to them, and they only left when he allowed them to leave. He was confirming who he was. Oftentimes after storms in our life, God will show you insurmountable things, and then he will remind you that they are insignificant to him, and that's to confirm your faith in him. How many times have we come through trials in our life, through storms in our life, and what happens immediately following that? We see some insurmountable thing in front of us again, and God takes care of it right away, and that's just for him showing off. He's saying, see, I told you. Have faith, not fear. You see, after the storm is when we learn the biggest lessons in life. During the storm, yes, but after the storm, if you pay attention, God's going to show you some things. After the storm, God will confirm things to you. Where God guides, he does provide. God will make sure that you are taken care of, and he will remind you of that after the storm. You see, during the storm we grow. During the storm, God knocks off the dust of our faith. But then after the storm, He confirms all of that with us. I have here in my notes, and it's so funny because if you guys ever want to preach out of my notes, good luck, because they're a hot mess. But I have here, tell the story of where God guides, He provides. I've told that story here before. I don't know if you want to hear it again, but I will. I should have written down another example. Maybe I should start giving myself bullet examples so I can pick and choose. But the thing of it is, my mom and dad, I think I've told this story here before, we were broke, we were destitute, we were traveling from one church to the other. My father had a church plant in Lewis County, Kentucky, and we were basically starving to death, and we didn't know what we were going to do. And we drove by this little church in West Liberty, Kentucky, and on that sign it said, "Where God guides, He provides." And my mom and dad pulled over, and they prayed, and they thanked God for that confirmation of faith in Him. You mean you think God had that pastor of that United Methodist Church go out there? Yeah, God talks to Methodists. Don't think He don't. You think God had that Methodist pastor go out there and put on that sign, that just for your family? Yes, I do. And you convince me otherwise when we're in heaven. Because you know what that did? That confirmed my mother and father's faith. That confirmed to them to suck it up and drive on and get back to Lewis County, and we'll pull in on fumes and we'll live on faith, and God will take care of it. You see, that's the thing with God. He conveys disappointment in us because we're children. We need taught, but then He confirms the faith that we have through things. Sometimes it's a little bitty child this big that running up and giving you a hug. Sometimes it's seeing an old friend somewhere that you hadn't seen for years and them saying, "Hey, I've been praying for you." There are no accidents with God. He will confirm some things to you if you pay attention after the storm. If you look and learn the lesson that God is trying to teach you, He will confirm some things to you. But I want you to notice this lastly. Not only did He convey disappointment and He confirmed their faith, but I want you to see, and this is key, He continued on His journey with them. In Mark 5, verse 1, it says this: "And they came unto the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gadarenes." And then look down in verse 21, it says this: "And when Jesus was passed over again by ship into the other side, much people gathered unto Him, and He was nigh unto the sea." Did you notice that? He got on a boat with them, and He went through a storm with them, and they failed miserably. And then He conveyed disappointment. Then He confirmed faith and coached them up. But He arrived. He didn't leave them in the middle of the sea. I mean, He could have just said, "All right, you bums are terrible. I'm going to find 12 more Jewish men," and just stepped off and walked away. He was Jesus. He didn't need that boat. He could have looked at Simon, Peter, and John, and James, and these, and been like, "Dead," and they just been gone, and sent them to heaven. Like, "I can't do anything with you." He could have turned time back, and they never been born. He was God. But He did not. He continued with them. You see, during the storms of your life, and you will fail, don't think you won't, because you will, because we all do. And after that disappointment and after that confirmation, just remember, Jesus is going to keep going with you. He's not going to leave you because you're not doing too good in a storm right now. He continued with them. He did not abandon them. He did not replace them. He did not get off the boat in Mark 5:1 and look at the demonic and cast the demons out and say, "Okay, you're the guy. I'm kicking these other guys out. I want you." He stayed with them just like He does you after the storms. Boy, I failed in the storms of my life, Pastor David. Well, acknowledge that, learn something from it, and just know that Jesus is going to still be with you during the next storm. He didn't abandon them. He didn't replace them. In verse 21, I even noticed this. Verse 21 says this, and when Jesus was passed over again by ship into the other side. Did you notice what happened there? He left. I mean, this isn't a big area they're going across. He got in a boat and he went across and found the storm and then came over here. And then he went right back in the same boat across the same water to the same place where he was before. He didn't leave them. He said, hey, you trust me enough to get in the boat before, get back in the boat and we'll go back across the same sea. And they did. You see, that's how it works with Jesus. He doesn't leave you. He doesn't abandon you. He doesn't forsake you. Sometimes he lets you go right back across the same sea and there's no storm and you see, oh, well, this wasn't so scary after all, God. You see, there's a blessing in the detail when you see it. There's a blessing when you see the same men in the same boat on the same sea with the same Savior. That's what happens to you after the storm. God keeps going with you. There are more storms in the gospel. Matthew 14:22, we see Jesus Christ walking on the water. Matthew 14, Mark 6, John 6. These are three different storms, three different instances recorded in the Gospels of storms that the disciples and the apostles found themselves in with Jesus Christ. And every single time, they don't handle it exactly right, but every single time, Jesus keeps going with them to the next storm. He goes, okay, we got through this storm, and there's doubt, and there's fear, and there's lack of faith. But I'm going to keep going with you to the next storm. That's what you got to look forward to. I had a mother tell me one time at Grace Baptist Church when I was teaching the teens, and if she's watching, love her heart, I ain't going to say her, and love her heart, she knows who she is. But she told me that I was, quote, too negative. Too negative. I said, it's a negative world we live in. I am preparing your teenager to live in the real world, not in a daydream. Her child's not serving God right now. As far away from God as you can get. Why? Because they don't want to hear the negative lessons. But the positive is this. He kept going with them. And they failed him. And every storm you see the apostles and Jesus in, they don't do it right. But Jesus still loves them. He still goes with them, just like he will you. Maybe you're not on the backside of a storm. Maybe you're right in the middle of a storm. And if you are right in the middle of a storm, let me just say this. God's still with you. He's in control of things. He is not surprised by where you are. Matter of fact, he may have put you there for a reason. Matter of fact, I guarantee you he did. There is a reason for every storm, even when we cannot see it. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. And I love to read Peter. I wish I was a Paul, but I am truly more like the Apostle Simon Peter. I always have my foot in my mouth. I say the wrong things at the wrong times to the wrong people. But if you remember, during one of those storms, it was Peter that stepped out of the boat and took some steps towards Jesus. And then what did he have? No faith. And he began to sink. And things were terrible. He saw the winds and the waves. And that's how you feel sometimes. Man, God, I got out of the boat. I'm doing good. And then you fail. But I wonder if Peter was thinking about his failed walk on the water when he penned the words in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, which say this, casting all your cares upon him, for he careth for you. Had Jesus not cared about Peter, he would have let him drown in the sea. But he loved him so much, he stuck his hand down and picked him up. Don't forget that Jesus careth for you. Don't worry about him caring for me. He cares for me. Don't you worry. Don't you look over here and, oh, they got a storm. I wonder, does God care for them? He does. Does he care for you? Yes, he does. If you're a saint of God, he loves you. And he will see you through this storm. And then on the backside of the storm, you can look back. And guess what? You will gain wisdom. You will gain strength. You will gain faith if you look back on the storm and see what God was teaching you. Some storms in life, you will never know why you went through them. Spoiler alert, that's why it happens. I don't know. I wish I could tell you that every single storm in your life, you could look back and do a post-event analysis, I think is what they call it some places. Oh, this is why God did this. You'll never know sometimes. But when you get to heaven, I guarantee you will. When you get to heaven, I'll guarantee you he'll say, see, if you wouldn't have been here for that storm, then you never would have been here for this victory. Don't worry about connecting the dots, Christian. Just worry about keeping your faith in the Lord. And just know that if you're in a storm, I heard this too. I'll share this with you. And I thought it was very poignant. There was a preacher that said, and I think maybe Miss Vanessa shared this. I heard something similar. Said that you're in a storm, or you're out of a storm, you're getting to go into another storm. That's true. It's true. That's life. But God will never leave you there. Every head bowed and every eye closed. You know, I don't know everyone's situation, and I don't know where we're at storm-wise. But I will tell you this. This is a place to be on a Wednesday night if you're in the middle of a storm. I also know that this is the place to be on a Wednesday night if you are in between storms. And this is the place to be on a Wednesday night if you've just come out of a storm. This is a good place to be. If you're in the storm, keep the faith. Keep the prayers up. Keep the faith up. Push the fears aside. Face it, knowing you're facing it with the master of the sea. In those times, in those storms, when you feel like God has forgotten about you, cry out to him, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he will whisper, I never did. Or maybe it's after a storm and you're reflecting now. Learn from that storm and learn and see that God's still with you and that he is confirming some things to you right now. Or maybe you're on an easy sea right now and you just know that a storm's coming. Be ready for it. Remember the lessons you learned in past storms. Cast all your cares on him, for he careth for you. Dear God, Father, Lord, I come to you and I thank you for our church family. I thank you for loving folks. God, I thank you for reminders in your word. God, I thank you that the Bible is a living, breathing book that we can read the same passage today and then read it 10 years from now when it's a different time in our life and it speaks to us in a completely different way. God, I do pray for those going through storms right now. I know there are many. God, I pray that you would help them with their faith and help them keep that fear in check. God, I pray for those that maybe just came out of a great storm. God, I pray that as all of us need to, that we'll take the time to learn the lessons that we need to learn. And God, if there's anyone here right now and they're getting ready to go through a trial, we don't even expect it. We never know when the storm's going to hit. God, I pray you will just shore them up this evening. God, just give them the strength that they'll need. God, let us as a church family love on each other because we need support during those times. God, thank you again for all that you've done for us and loving us and keeping us in your name. Amen. You are dismissed.